All right, everyone. Welcome to our panel discussion, Building Diasporic Solidarity Through Art. My name is Amita Vempati. I am the program lead for the Social Justice Series here at Brooklyn Raga Massive. And we are so excited for all of you to be joining us in conversation today.
All right, everyone.
Let me turn myself off mute here. Sorry. With that, I do want to introduce, before we get on to our esteemed group of panelists, a little bit about the event that we've been hosting over the past month. This event is called Subcontinent on the Hudson, South Asian Migrations and Musics in New York. This series follows on the topics that we have been discussing within our social justice conversations. We focused, starting last year, on the WIAFs, then caste politics and South Indian drumming, and then finally we had Music of Afghanistan in February. And the reason why we wanted to focus or hone in a little bit on the experiences of South Asian immigration to New York City is because we really felt that as a organization comprised predominantly of South Asian American musicians as well as audience members, that we need to begin interrogating and unpacking where privilege lies in our own networks, and how we can build greater diasporic solidarity in our local art scene and as well as just our local communities more generally. Toward that end, there are a few goals that we had set for this series. The first of is to celebrate the diversity of experiences and artistic traditions in New York South Asian communities. I'll share a little bit about the events that we did in this month leading up to this panel discussion, but hopefully we've given everyone a little taste of this diversity as it extends past, say, an Indo-centric model of celebrating cultural contributions by South Asians and Indo-Caribbean communities in the United States. Next, our goal is to examine the impacts of capitalism and ethno-nationalism on immigrant communities, namely how living under late-stage capitalism and having economic obligations that force us to work so that we can live, twinned with the fact that sometimes our communities can get very insular along nationalist lines, can have detrimental effects to how immigrants communities can express themselves creatively and build in solidarity together. The third goal is to interrogate privilege within immigrant communities and challenge the singularizing myth of the model minority. This is the myth that that there is one vision of South Asian immigrant, and that sometimes this myth of the model minority is used to drive a wedge between South Asian immigrants and other immigrants of color and other communities of color in the United States. So we would like to, again, continue to interrogate that privilege and unpack that within our artist and audience communities throughout this series and this discussion. And finally, the goal is, as always with all of our work, to build solidarity in the South Asian diaspora and amongst all immigrant populations, specifically those in New York. But I think we have found that this is a conversation that extends far beyond the limits of a city and can have a lot of implications for how we discuss South Asian immigrant politics, probably all over the United States, if not even further. To cover, we've had 3 events this month leading up to this panel discussion. The first was a screening of the documentary 12 Days in a Taxi, which shared the story of an aspiring filmmaker who works as a taxi driver in New York City, as a recent immigrant or as even a not so recent immigrant from India, who is forced to work both as a taxi driver and as a cinematographer. He struggles with the ability to realize his cinematic dreams. And this event invited a lot of conversation into how our artistic spaces can be economically and class inclusive, as well as how the impacts of living in a city like New York under late stage capitalism can have, as I said before, extremely detrimental effects to how immigrant communities and people within immigrant communities can express themselves creatively and realize their creative dreams more broadly. Our second event was this super dope playlist curation workshop by Anissa Jackson, otherwise known as DJ Cardamami. They curate music from all over the world, and through this playlist curation workshop, they shared some tips for being able to bring music together from across the world and really come up with a cohesive playlist so that we can begin inviting, as BRM so often does, the idea that multiple genres can coexist in our artistic spaces and be part of these cohesive, international, and globally inspired local sonicscapes. And then finally, last week, we were really privileged to have the incredible Tibetan folk artist Taechung, who presented Healing in Art and Exile, which was dually a performance as well as a discussion on his upbringing in exile in India, as well as his musical education within the Tibetan community in India, and how that has shaped his musical repertoire as well as what he performs for others now living in New York. So as you can see, we've tried to sort of bring this very broad swath of conversations into a month of programming. But I think with this final event, we're getting ready to open the floodgates once more for really exploring this topic and how our individual experiences can really come together and build a more unified and strengthened diasporic community in New York City, and as I mentioned, beyond. So with that, I would actually like to begin inviting our panelists to introduce themselves. We have basically a really interesting mélange of characters today. I would like to invite, we have two musicians who are joining us, two career musicians, and I would like to invite them to introduce themselves. Maybe we can start with Zarifa Adiba. If you'd like to introduce yourself, Zarifa.
Hi, everybody. I'm Zarifa Adiba, and I'm 24 years old. I'm from Afghanistan. Currently, I'm busy studying international politics at Bard College. But beside that, I've recently moved to New York. It has been 4 months that I'm here, and I'm working with different musicals in New York. That's me. But just to give a little bit of background about my past, what I have done musically was I was so honored to be one of the first female conductors of Afghanistan, and I had the honor to conduct the first and only female orchestra at the World Economic Forum in 2017 and play the lead violist among them. We have performed in Switzerland and Germany, also many performances in Afghanistan with the female orchestra and also other ensembles that we had in school. And right now I have back in Afghanistan, so I studied music 3 years in secret. Nobody knew about it, but once my family and everybody got to know that I'm studying music, I had to stop once I appeared on the television after Davos World Economic Forum. I stopped music in 2017 after my concert, and then I had to find a way to achieve all dreams that I had. So I chose to study international politics at the American University of Central Asia. I got full scholarship there. And the dreams I had was that I'm going back to my country and I'm going to work for the education system in my country, and I will make music as a primary education and in all school for all children. That was the dream I had, and that was the dream that I was living for. But unfortunately, last year, Taliban took over, and now not just music is banned, but girls are not allowed to go to school either. So I ended up in exile. I ended up in New York, and I'm here. But one good thing that happened to me coming to New York is that I started my music career again, and I'm doing music, and I hope that I will be able to do music more. And I'm so excited for this program. Thanks for having me, Amita.
Thank you, Zarifa, for that introduction. I know I hope that we will have more time to hear your whole story. And I just want to invite that for those of us who might be joining us for the first time for a BRM event, that actually one of Zarifa's colleagues, one of the other first female conductors in Afghanistan, Negin, was with us in February during our panelist Fusions and Futurisms in Afghan Music, which is available on YouTube. So if you would like to check out that very rich discussion, please feel free to. So excited to have you here, Zarifa, and as we said before, bring you into our lovely New York family. Welcome. And with that, I would like to invite our next panelist, Nathalie Barret-Mas, to introduce herself.
Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be a part of this conversation. I am a musician, or I like to say music maker, from Reunion. Reunion is a beautiful island in the Indian Ocean off the coast of Madagascar, the French island. I grew up there and started playing the violin when I was 6 years old, and I went to the conservatory until the end of high school. And then I moved to Australia, where I pursued my bachelor's in classical performance. And about 8 years ago, I moved to New York. And that's really when musically I started expanding a lot more outside of classical music. I was always like, as a kid, as a teenager, I was always very interested by other styles of music and improvising and singing, but I never really pursued it until moving to New York and then being in such a diverse and exciting environment. It felt really freeing. And so I started playing in jazz ensembles, for singer-songwriters, for off-Broadway productions, like all kind of different styles of music, until eventually working for about like over a year, I'd say, recording and touring with Beyonce and Jay-Z. So that was definitely like my American dream kind of coming true. And it's really during that time that I started developing my own music. And I think I just got so much inspiration from the work environment, the different places I went to, that I started letting it out in my own way. So I do a lot of live looping and live beat making, and I layer strings and voice and percussions to kind of like create the illusion of a full band, but it's a solo act, and it has a lot of influences from different musics that have raised me. I would say in the last couple of years, I started kind of also expanding more in the education realm and curation sphere. So I run a jam session, and I teach at a few different outreach programs, and I feel like it's really balancing me out as a human. I would say the last thing I would say to kind of like give a little background on how I'm entering this conversation. So like I said, Reunion is a French island, but the thing that I'm the most in love with about my island is the diversity that exists there, the diversity of cultures. So when it was colonized by the French, but also by the British and the Portuguese, and they brought workers and slaves from India, China, Mozambique. And so culturally, it's really, really rich. And I grew up driving by a church and a mosque and a temple, and everything was always really respectful of those different traditions. So moving here, it was very natural for me to be so mixed, for my identity to be so diverse. And on top of it, my mom is Spanish, so I also have this heritage. So I feel like the biggest challenge that I've encountered was trying to explain this diversity here in the US, where it feels like you very much have to fit in the box that's already there. And so a lot of the music that I started making was to kind of like invite each other to have more curious conversations about identity and like understanding the different layers that we all carry. And so I feel like I'm entering this conversation as Natty. Like I have a very strong sense of self, and I'm sure immigrants in general can relate to that, because we have to assert ourselves outside of our home, of our like comfort base, but also as a Reunionese in New York, which always requires educating people on what reunion is, and also as a Reunionese carrying Indian roots, but being really unclear about what those roots are, and all of the knowledge I still have to research to fully understand all of those different roots. So I feel like there's lots of layers, and I'm excited to discuss with you all.
Thank you so much, Natty, for trying to unpack those many layers. I really appreciate that discussions about identity inform our, I think, as you put it, like are, informing your art in this really palpable way right now, especially as you, continue to explore artistically in New York. I think certainly, as you said, also, I think this is a very common thread amongst all immigrants, a sense of self, and certainly self is what informs art. And I'm just so happy that you are here with us today, and that you got to accomplish the universal American dream of just being proximate to Beyonce. Musician or not, I feel like that is a pretty universal American dream. So you made it. Congratulations. So thank you so much, Zarifa and Nati, for sharing. I'd like to, with that, invite that in addition to our two career musicians, we also have two representatives from the incredible organization Desis Rising Up and Moving, who we were so honored to curate the series in partnership with. And Drum, Desis Rising Up and Moving becomes Drum. Drum has done incredible work for the past few decades, specifically working with South Asian and Indo Caribbean communities in New York City. So we're so honored to have both Jagpreet and Amna here from Drum today to introduce themselves, as well as introduce some of their experiences and the work that they're doing. I want to say thank you in both the past sense, but also presently and in the future for continuing to share your expertise with communities that, like ours, that need to become more familiarized with what it means to be addressing and assessing the needs of immigrant communities in New York City. So with that, I'd like to invite Jagpreet and Amna, if you would both like to introduce yourselves, introduce your work, however you see fit. Welcome back. Thank you.
Thank you, Amita, and thank you to all of Brooklyn Raga Massive for inviting us to this wonderful series. I think these conversations are very important and need to be had in our communities, especially in times like these. My name is Jagpreet Singh. I'm the political director at Drum, Desis Rising Up and Moving. We were founded in 1999 in response to the shooting of Amadou Diallo, who was a Guinean immigrant in the Bronx who was gunned down by the police. In response to the murder of Amadou by the police, many, especially African immigrant communities and Black communities, rose up in the city and launched actions, marches, rallies And a lot of the South Asian, Indo-Caribbean folks that initially comprised of Drum saw a need to kind of activate our own communities and make sure that we were forefront and present within the struggle, since this is something that impacted us day to day. Police violence, brutality, the institutional violence. In 1999, we organized a small march in Jackson Heights, which at that time was the only central South Asian community in New York City. And from there, we generally grew. We currently work to organize working class South Asian and Indo-Caribbean communities across New York City. We have bases in Queens, Brooklyn, Bronx, basically wherever our communities are residing. And we work on a number of issues, including immigration, local fights, like we're part of a 10-year campaign to get undocumented New Yorkers the ability to get driver's licenses. Part of a long time fight to get the right for undocumented New Yorkers to vote in local municipal elections, receive the same sort of services that others receive in the city. And the crux of our fight is to center the kind of livelihood and stories of our working class South Asian and Indo-Caribbean communities here in New York. And a lot of the work we do has come out of that, and has created a sense of solidarity amongst our communities, right? Recently, we were involved in a case of one of our members, Prakashan, who was entrapped by the police and forced to sign a confession as a child, basically, and languished behind bars for a long time. And we saw a resurgence and a movement of many working class folks across different communities coming to support him. And we activated our membership and base, which comprises of communities across different sects of the South Asian community. Prakash is an Indo-Guyanese, Indo-Caribbean member, but we saw our Bangladeshi, our Punjabi, our Indian members all rile up and understand the injustices that were happening and push to fight, where we were able to, with the other efforts of others, get the DA to drop all charges, and currently he is free. So these are just a little bit of the kind of campaigns that we fight and we've been pushing towards. Personally, I am a New Yorker, born in Coney Island, live in Queens currently, not too far from Jackson Heights. My local Gurdwara is in New York, my family is in New York. It is home to me. I am the son of a Punjabi singer and poet who learned from Sant Ram Udasi, who was a very famous Naxal Marxist poet in Punjab in the 70s and 80s, and kind of those traditions are what guide me. I'm happy to be here sharing space with y'all.
Thanks, Japri. Hi, everyone. My name is Amna. I use she, her pronouns. I am also at Drum. I'm the organizer designated for Little Pakistan, Flatbush Midwood area. I'm Pakistani. I'm also working class, born and raised in Kensington, Brooklyn. And I just wanted to dive a little deeper into our histories at Drum. As Jakpreet mentioned, Drum is an organization of working class, Desi, South Asian, Indo-Caribbean members in New York. And we work on issues that impact our community, like immigration, racial justice, education, workers' rights, gender justice. And Drum, as Jakpreet mentioned, was founded in 1999, and it was coming from that police accountability movement in the late 90s in New York. And initially, we started off by doing immigration-related services, like helping people in detention centers, but we quickly realized it wasn't getting at the root causes of the issues in our community. Drum was on the ground during 9/11 and the National Security Exit Entry Registration System, or also known as NCRs, predominantly Muslims, which led to many folks who were undocumented, even if they had no criminal record, being deported. And so loved ones didn't know where their family members were as they went missing. And Little Pakistan in Kensington, Brooklyn, for example, the other border of the neighborhood I'm from, became a ghost town, as did Little Egypt. Both were amongst the hardest hit communities. And at a time of extremist Islamophobia, people were hearing the horror stories of people being tortured, the infiltration of informants. It even led to a lot of people, including current Drum's family members, choosing to self-deport. We lost a lot of our membership, and we don't have as many of the same members as we did in the early 2000s. And that was also the formative years of doing this work. And so today, as that designated Pakistani organizer, I'm thinking a lot about the impacts of that surveillance trauma and the healing that's needed to reactivate that area. As we're realizing, our safety and security is tied to each other. Our government on all levels are not doing enough, and we need to build communities, solidarity amongst each other, and that's the approach that we're taking. So, as you know, there were massive floods in Pakistan 2 months ago. Over 1/3 of the country is underwater. There's been 8 weeks of consecutive flooding. A lot of people don't have access to that clean water. A lot of those crops have been destroyed. And being a product of the diaspora and living in the belly of the beast, we have to think about a responsibility and relationship of the global north to the global south. And we at Drum just launched a campaign to demand temporary protected status, also known as TPS, and special status relief, SSR, for undocumented visiting and international students that are Pakistani, and so that they can work and support their families and relief efforts back home. We are also uplifting the demand for loss and damage reparations, and if passed, nearly 60,000 Pakistani immigrants in the states and counting would be impacted. So we'd love to have you all please sign and share our Move On petition. I'll put the link in the chat at the end. But at Drum, we really believe essentially in this concept of mass protagonism, of building that local leadership and giving otherwise fractured communities a unified voice, of providing investment and ownership, providing structure in these social justice transformations that we're thinking about so that people are seen as subjects and not objects. And essentially, we're not waiting around for a community leader or famous activist or someone else to save us. How do we get it to get the ones that are affected by it to take up that fight? And that's why our gender justice work is about creating that protagonism. We do this by creating opportunities to embrace themselves. And we're not doing the same work as we are in all of our bases. We're addressing things that people want to address. In Western Queens, people wanted to do a live performance, a natuk. And even though we know gender-based violence exists, a lot of people don't understand what does it mean to act out street harassment in front of people and show how that's damaging in front of our communities. In Kensington, for example, a lot of these stories are not talked about openly, and that's why a lot of people think this problem is a personal problem. And that's why our Kensington group decided to do an audio project to document our experiences with violence. And for the first time in Drum's organizing history in Brooklyn, we had a public conversation on gender violence on the plaza where we blasted those oral histories and reclaimed our space. Women who have never believed that they are the main character of their story are now the same ones creating an agenda, facilitating online discussions on how to support those who experience domestic violence, organizing a rent strike, and creating a space for that collective healing. At Drum, we're tired of hearing these stories of suffering. We want to talk about power and safety as a shift, and we engage people directly. And now in this time, we're figuring out those new ways to organize, including running these campaigns, such as gender justice and global justice. I just wanted to end with one of my favorite quotes by Mariam Kaba, hope is a discipline, and that is something that we commit to actively on the daily. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amna and Jagpreet, for sharing these really vital perspectives that I feel I just want to introduce. I realize I didn't introduce my own positionality in this conversation, but just to sort of offer where I feel like this conversation is particularly important. I'm a second generation Indian American. I grew up in the suburbs of Plano, Texas, in a non-working class family that has caste privilege, among other things. And I would like to say that a lot of the topics around police brutality, detention, deportation, just violence from our governments and our institutions is not really spoken about, is not really seen as being an issue of South Asian, is not really seen as a South Asian issue per se, when you don't have proximity to the people, the affected communities who are really at the forefront of experiencing that violence. So I just really want to thank both of you for sharing that history of drums work, where you all are coming from, because it is, I know when I first heard of drum, it was such a new moment for me to realize that these struggles are interconnected. And once we focus on, as we say, uplifting all of these individual protagonists and coming together as communities, that we can really see how we can be a part of that uplifting and not wait for an institution rife with, say, white supremacy or police violence to do that job for us. I would like to just name very quickly that the petition that Amna spoke about to advocate for temporary protected status for Pakistani climate change refugees is linked in our YouTube caption. So please visit there to sign the petition. You can also find a link in that caption to contribute to Drum's Mutual Aid Fund. So if you do have energy to contribute financially at this moment, we would really appreciate you doing so. Once again, thank you to all of you for being a part of this discussion. We haven't even gotten to the questions yet. This is just the introductions, but like already so rich. And with that, maybe it is a good time to move to our questions. So in typical panel form, I came up with some questions, but I would like to invite that this conversation is wherever we would all like to take it. For those of you watching at home, please feel free to avail of the chat in the YouTube live. It should be on the right side of your screen. If you have questions for any of our panelists, please feel free to drop them there. And of course, to all of our panelists, this is your opportunity to share more of your thoughts regarding this really, as I said, rich conversation that we can all be having to become closer to each other. So the first question is, I think this is something that Amna and Jagpreet have sort of talked about in terms of like the journey of witnessing how solidarity is built. The first question is, where do you witness solidarity in South Asian, Indo-Caribbean immigrant communities? And what are some challenges that exist in building that solidarity? Or what are some exist in us recognizing that that solidarity is something we can be working towards? And I invite the panelists to unmute as they see fit, and we can personally avail of our Zoom chat to keep tabs on each other.
I get it started. If Jagpreet, you want to go? No. Okay. I would say that as a performer, I've felt a lot of solidarity in numbers, in how like the community just comes out to support the events, whether it's been visual art or music or fundraising for some type of community programming. It's as a performer, it feels like the room is really filled by like everybody who could come out and heard about it is here. But on the flip side, I would say a challenge is probably recognizing, acknowledging, and taking the time to continue to learn about each other, because while we are in this big under this big umbrella of South Asian, Indo Caribbean immigrants, there is so much that maybe we don't even know about each other, and we are under this umbrella here. But if we were back home, that umbrella would be different, much smaller. So I would say, I feel like, at least on my personal level, the first challenge is to really make sure that I continue to learn and ask questions and not move from assumptions about other places.
Yeah, I take a look at a lot of our history, not only here in New York City or America, but across the diaspora. In the 70s in London and UK, we saw an emergence of solidarity not only amongst South Asian immigrant and first generation communities there, but with the Black communities and pushing back against state violence. The Brixton riots in the 70s had both South Asian youth and Black youth at the front lines pushing back against police violence in that community. A lot of the international worker union movements that occurred in the 70s, both in Canada as well as England, included a lot of solidarity between various groups. And we saw similar movements in the United Farm Workers movement in California. Again, not only among South Asian communities, but across the spectrum of working class immigrant narratives. I think in New York City is a good example of where there's a lot more of kind of movement and communication and kind of that cultural synchronicity that's happening between the various South Asian communities. A great example of this is Richmond Hill, where I have a lot of family. I've lived for a couple of years before. This is a place that was settled both by the Indo-Caribbean Guyanese community and the North Indian Punjabi Sikh community, starting from the 70s. The first Gurdwara on the East Coast and one of the first mandirs in all of America was in Richmond Hill. After white flight, there was a lot of cheaper homes there with driveways and backyards. And we saw large migration of the community there. At this point, it's a staple of Queens culture, of what makes Queens an international community. But those communities live right next to each other. We have a lot of people within our membership who come from mixed background because of relationships between those two communities. And kind of like the influx of how music has even been influenced in the 90s and early 2000s, with a lot of Caribbean beats finding themselves into Punjabi music that was being produced here in New York City. Great example even is DJ Rekha, who is very apt within and in touch with kind of that cultural shift that was happening here. So there's definitely a lot of solidarity that exists, but there's also challenges. One thing I'll say about New York City is the South Asian history here is a working class history. The first migrants here were Bangladeshi, Bengali ship jumpers who moved to Harlem. Check out, I think, Vivek Bald's book, Bengali Harlem, as well as new documentary that just is coming out, In Search of Bengali Harlem. There was a lot of textile workers here from the South Asian subcontinent. History of the Ghadar Party, which helped fight for freedom in South Asia during British rule, had offices here in New York City. So a lot of that history is working class, but when we saw an influx of a wealthier, predominantly Indian population moving in within the 80s and 90s, kind of the image of South Asians in New York City is starting to flip. And especially now, with a lot more entering the finance field and tech, there's a lot of challenges, and they're also accumulating political capital. So there's fights that we have here. There was give you a good example of this. Recently, there was a Gandhi statue that was defaced in Richmond Hill, outside of Indo-Caribbean Mandir. And it was done by Punjabi Sikh youth. It's tough. It's a tough situation that is happening, but the kind of wealthier Indian community has been pushing for this to be charged as a hate crime on the basis of religion, when the targeting of the attack was more political. I don't want to say, I don't want to put words or actions into why that statue was targeted, but statues of Gandhi that have been targeted in the past have been more of a political sense or other senses rather than anti-Hindu hate crime. So these sorts of issues do prop up, but I think for the most part, especially the communities that are coming here, whether they're undocumented or working class, are building that sense of solidarity when organizing opportunities are presented?
As I mentioned earlier, it has been just 4 months that I'm away. I'm in New York. It has been a very, very short time that I'm here. I haven't made any specific community that has been like Afghans or Pakistanis or Indian or South Asian in completely. I haven't been I haven't interacted to a community like that, but once we had a concert called Experience Afghanistan, and we had a singer who is very famous Afghan singer, and he was there and he sang. And I could see literally the people who have been living in the United States, in New York especially, the Afghans, they had tears and they were crying. And at that moment, as a musician, I'm talking that I understood that music is one of the most beautiful tools that can bring people together and remind them of solidarity and remind them of seeing the good part wherever they are. It is hard to live in exile. It is hard to be an immigrant. I know that, but let's not like, it's just personal experience that at the same time that I'm away from my home, at the same time that I'm away from my community, I feel like now I have a broader space where I know broader people and where I can represent my part of myself. So the challenges that exist in building that solidarity, I guess, because I have been away for a very short time, I haven't seen that. But I think music can be a very good tool to build that solidarity among not just Afghans or Pakistanis or Indians, but among all people from different countries, not just South Asian, but generally. That can be a very good tool to bring solidarity, unity, love, and acceptance among all. Yeah.
Well, I could tell you someplace you can witness solidarity happening right here, right now. It's at the Museum of the City of New York, the City of Faith exhibit curated by Dr. Azra Daoud. And Drum's work is featured there, including the history of the oral histories that we've documented of gender-based violence. And you can see some photographs memorializing that as well as the post 9/11 impact on our communities. I'll add the link in the chat. And in addition, I would say solidarity is witnessed, within those working class spaces. And that's why a lot of our membership is intentionally only working class. You'll see it in these industries like retail and restaurant, like delivery, like construction, tech workers, taxi workers, street vendors, you name it, who are the heart and soul of the city. One place that comes to mind is when I worked at the New York Taxi Workers Alliance. We saw the struggle with the medallion and how that rally lasted for 46 days, with 15 of them being a hunger strike. And so as many alliance members noted, like that medallion was the root of those problems. And it's one of the few, as Bairavi Desai, the executive director, had noted, it's one of the few professions in the world where you are not only not guaranteed an income, but you might end a 12-hour workday losing the money that you started with. But at the same time, it goes without saying that, the people at the New York Taxi Workers Alliance, they became like my family. And I just wanted to share some anecdotes of what I saw. Was like, much like my mom, whose love language is not to say I love you, but to cut fruits or make food. Mr. Singh, a Sikh uncle, would buy me samosas and make chai. And Saibu, Noordin, and Tipu, our cover man for the magazine that was featured in the strike. And Maria and I would start carpooling at night. And Javed Bai, our local historian and living archive, and also the co-founder of the Alliance, would gift me that book Taxi by Bijou Matthew. Samreen, she got me sushi on my last day. And really, all this to say, to witness the multilingual, multi-ethnic, and national conversations being had on the daily is something that can't be described but experienced. And in a time of extreme turmoil and tensions with existing countries like Pakistan and India, that love and solidarity that we had for each other was unmatched. And we discussed religion and politics and past lives and everything in between. And I ended up giving a hug to Mr. Singh on my last day, and he called me Beti, which like means daughter. And I knew that I would miss him as much as he would miss me as much as I would. And when we think about the challenges that come, I think we think also about the lack of class consciousness in some of these spaces, or the lack of acknowledgement of our own histories. For example, as a Pakistani American, like I was born and raised in Kensington, Brooklyn, but that includes both Little Pakistan and Little Bangladesh. And growing up in Little Bangladesh as a Pakistani American had taught me a lot about the privileges that I possess, the inequities that must be addressed, and like the surrounding organizing efforts. For those to an outsider looking in, the difference is subtle. It's often confused for the same, but both are Muslim majority countries and both were once a part of India. And living in the US, it's true, a lot of our current struggles, such as Islamophobia or immigration, are shared or the same. But though I, growing up, knew that Pakistan and Bangladesh split due to war, which I thought was inevitable because of the physical body of law, water and language barrier that separated them, I didn't understand why. And I learned about the Bangladesh Liberation War. I learned about the Bangladesh genocide. And I heard stories of my friends' grandparents being Bengali freedom fighters, their mothers being the product of systematic rape by Pakistani soldiers, or escaping Pakistan after partition, and themselves being subject to those stereotypes as a superiority complex from their Pakistani peers. And so in thinking about these things, we're thinking about the acknowledgement of those systematic events, and whether it's on an international level or domestic, our identities are built around the institutional memories and generational traumas.
Wow. I have to thank all of you for, I think, touching on so many different points. I am just going to pick out a few that I hope sort of make sense between all these amazing responses. The first, I would like to really thank how Jagpreet and Amna, like I really appreciate how both of you are helping us situate these experiences within New York City geographically. I think that's really important for us, especially as we talk about things like how, you know, financial privilege and class privilege and a lack of class consciousness is contributing to things like gentrification, and how sometimes South Asian Americans can be part of the problem when there is no, like say, class or class consciousness or intercommunal solidarity. I'd really like to thank that you are naming like where these communities thrive and where we can, be just aware of their physical existence within the city. I'd also really like to thank how all of you have integrated these artistic responses, maybe because this is a panel about art. So like, thanks for staying on brand. But like, I just really want to appreciate that like there is this conversation sort of forming about what it means to shape your art around, like it is shaped around you and also what you carry with you. And I think that as Zarifa mentioned, certainly art is such a tool of building solidarity within communities. I would like to name that, one of the reasons why I personally was really excited for the Music of Afghanistan series was because a lot of South Asian classical musicians who do raga-based music do not understand that Afghan classici is also raga-based, and that we share a lot of these common musical and theoretical tropes together. And as Nati was sort of speaking to, I'm also just really glad that like these artistic communities are really showing up. And, we show up for things that make us not only feel empowered, but that make us happy and give us a sense of belonging. So just really want to thank how all of your responses really spoke to that. And actually, I know that in our email, I had actually scheduled this question to be last, but I think it makes more sense given the way that this discussion is going, that maybe we do the last question second, if that's okay. I'm switching things up, keeping things exciting. But I think maybe this is a good time to ask, because also I just want to name like how all of you also like, yes, really talked about like how these international and global experiences are informing your art on a local level, informing community building on a local level. So with that, this is a two-part question, kind of comparing how we see this art living at these two levels. So questions are, where can South Asian and Indo-Caribbean artists be helpful in movement building at a local level? And the second part to that is, how can we imagine artistic solidarity that is both global and distinct to New York? A big chunky question, but welcome any answers.
So art for, I mean, even within the classic South Asian tradition of community building, but beyond that, of revolution, of waging militant practices, art has been very closely tied to many of our movements. I mentioned the Ghadar Party before, who were kind of exiles from South Asia during the fight against British colonial powers, and they created movements across the diaspora, namely in California, New York, and Vancouver, around building consciousness amongst the diaspora of why we need to fight off the British, but also lobbying Western governments and going as far as fundraising to collect arms to fight an armed struggle against the British. One of the activities they did to get together to kind of tap back into the homeland was these kind of Gwali style musical nights where they got together and just sang, recited poetry, which was a very important part of connecting them to the struggle, because these were the same songs, the same poems that their comrades in South Asia who were actively fighting were also engaged in. I think, and on a more contemporary level, one of the largest concerts that happened in Central Park was Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan in 1997. They still can't really put a number onto how big the crowd was, but it was giant. And it was made up of Indians, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, who all came together and literally were dancing in Central Park, took over for the day. I bring these two examples up because art has a way of bringing us together, of not only building movements, but building community, and that sense of community, that idea of community. Whenever there's, we have a public plaza here in Jackson Heights called Diversity Plaza. It's in the middle of the kind of the South Asian community. Whenever there's a natak, a play, a musical performance, doesn't matter which of the various, whether it's Nepali or Bangladeshi or Pakistani or whatever it may be, Indo-Caribbean, everybody comes to watch and takes time out of their day to see what's going on, to kind of experience that culture, to kind of build that together. And I think ensuring that the art is accessible to the working class community is very important, especially if the art is about them or the art is meant to bring them together. And we get that a lot here in New York City, which is why I love this city as well. There's a lot of opportunity for that. And then the other thing is like making sure that we're uplifting kind of the revolutionary spirit that has existed and will continue to exist within our people, within our cultures, within our communities, and not kind of falling into the traps of liberalism over and over, and making sure that we're pushing the envelope is very important, in my opinion.
I will go second, I guess. Okay. Maybe Nati, if you go, I would. I will have just a moment. Sorry.
Sure, no problem. I feel like the most like local level, and this goes even beyond artists. I just as immigrants in general here in America, that is the first step. I feel like it's education, and by that is it's very simple things. But for example, for me, every time I meet somebody and I share my name and where I'm from, I know that it's going to be a short segment that's going to be a geography lesson. And for a while, like after maybe like a year here explaining where I was from, I gave up and I would just say I'm French, because it would make the conversation just easier, and I wouldn't have to deal with all the cliche and misunderstandings that would come with trying to explain where I was from. And then I realized, no, actually it's part of what I have to do to say I am from Reunion and this is where it is and this is what it means. So I feel like the most basic local level is taking that time to just, share and explain where we're all from and what it means. And on a artistic level, I feel like the way to really activate that solidarity, whether it's among each other or actually more with Americans or other cultures, is to, through our or at least on for in my artistic journey, that's what I'm finding, is that I have to go back to the most human traits, because below being South Asian or below being a woman or below being an artist, we are humans. And so I think that if we can find that thread that all connects us, then we can open up to like those conversations with more specificities on each of the different humans that are in the conversations. But I think that we have to remember the common threads that we all share as humans.
I can go next. So, really movements don't exist without art. The movement is art. Art is movement. And in the same way we've thought about mass protagonism, of being the people being the main character of their own stories, we've also seen art as a tool for the storytelling. And then we can think about the transferable skills that we all possess. And, for example, I think about my mother, and to this day, she remains a mystery. And for years, I've asked her and pried about her upbringing, and she refuses to tell me. And, I think about the generational trauma in her eyes. And maybe I don't need to know her story, because if I looked carefully enough, it's already woven in her embroidery, in her shisha stitch. And, I used to be ashamed of my culture, but as I've learned, it's that culture is the sum total of one's survival mechanisms. And so my mother and her ancestors may have been beaten by the patriarchal system, but they were rising off from it in ways that aren't overtly confrontational or controversial. And so for that, they found their spaces for survival and for thriving. And when it comes to these challenges, ultimately you can't have conversations about the community without the community. And we can think about how to imagine that solidarity that's both global and distinct, and thinking about the issues and where the collective struggle exists, be it climate resiliency as an example. It's applicable to both the hyperlocal level, be it like the no Brooklyn pipeline, or access to clean drinking water, or the environmental racism that we see in the Bronx, and in international spaces, like as of you seeing right now with the floods.
I think I'm last. Thank you, everyone. I really like these questions. even before when you told us about this, I really loved and I was excited to answer this. Just imagine, first of all, I would like to talk a little bit about what is happening back at home. Afghanistan and Pakistan. I spent like a few years of my childhood in Pakistan, and I love Pakistan. I have a lot of Pakistani friends, and I feel so close to the culture. But when I went back to Afghanistan, I know the political tension between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And everybody knows about the political tension between India and Pakistan. And people who live there, they know it better than anybody. So now when we are living abroad, when we are not living at home, here we have an opportunity to create something that should not bring people, South Asian people together, like just here, but it should help people to have an image that, oh, back at home even, that, oh, we can be friends, we can be together. You know, for example, just imagine me from Afghanistan playing violin, and I have my friend from India who's playing tabla, and I have my friend from Pakistan who's playing the piano. And we are not saying a word, we will speak through our music instrument, right? There we are representing this rich and beautiful friendship of these countries that are not being shown. We can do that literally in this part of the world. And this is not going to bring solidarity just among the communities, among the South Asian communities in New York, but it will help it will give kind of a beautiful image to people who are back home too, to have another idea about it. So it is not something small that, oh, we are doing it just for our community in New York, but it's not that. It's for everybody back home, and it's for everybody in other states too. And the second question, how can we imagine artistic solidarity that is both global and distinct to New York? I think that any artistic work, whether it's painting, whether it is theater show, whether it is movie, whether it is a book, whether it is music performance, when it is art, it is global itself, and I always said that music is a world language. You don't need words to express your feelings and your thoughts. You are playing that through your instrument. And the same goes with painting. The same goes with all arts that we have today in the world, that we don't need words to explain what we want to say, but we do that through our arts. And if through art we are creating solidarity and unity and harmony among people, it is global, first of all. And second, how to be distinct in New York. I think New York is a bigger, since I've come to New York, to be honest, I don't feel very much immigrant, because I feel everybody's immigrant in this city. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but here I think if it is globally, it is also for New York and to New York. So that's my answer for the question.
If I can, I wanted to add something real quick, because we've been questioning our privilege and how it impacts our communication. And I feel like there is a certain grounding that comes with knowing your roots, and something that I've discovered among the years here and getting to know the community here and the Black community here is really realizing my privilege of, like, even though parts of my roots are unclear, I have a much stronger sense of where I'm from and who my ancestors are. And I think that, you know, when we're talking about having a global impact or building this solidarity through art, I personally really hope that through my work and my career, I can create a bridge between New York and Reunion, so that Black and Brown people here can also have an experience of what it's like to be Black and Brown on another land, with another history, and how it affects how you carry yourself. And so
Thank you so much, everyone, for these really incredible. I cannot get over how rich all these responses are. Great job, everybody. I think once again, I'm just going to try and there's a few threads that really stood out to me. And I just want to name, I think, first of all, that this question, the more that we discussed it, the more that I was like, Amita, this is a question that makes people come up with a false binary between local and global. And as Zarifa mentioned, everyone in New York is basically, a lot of people are immigrants in New York City. So, maybe that distinction is becoming a little bit more blurred, especially as we remain connected in more accessible ways to communities back home. One thing I really enjoyed hearing about was Zarifa, you mentioning that if there is a musical performance, say between you and then like an Indian tabla player and a Pakistani pianist, it's both giving beauty like in the present moment, but it's also like expanding imagination, right? And it's expanding this imagination for people all over the world of what the solidarity could look like. And I think that it really made me appreciate even more the points that Jagpreet and Nati and Amna all spoke about, which is about how, for example, like this Nusrat concert in Central Park, like attracted so many people. And obviously it's not just Pakistani people, it's like all types of South Asian people and beyond. And just, I think naming that space in New York City and naming that moment of togetherness is so important. Amna, I also really love that you brought up, your relationship to your mother's artwork as well, because I think how we imagine, our artistic contributions can be so intricately interwoven, pun fully intended, with how we see our potential for expressing ourselves artistically, and that carries, as Nati was speaking about, a sense of who you are into this local/global space. So thank you all so much for that. With that, we do have a final question, and I want to invite anyone who's watching to avail of the chat in YouTube if you would like to ask. We will have a couple minutes for questions afterward. But with that, oh no, that's also important, but we'll get to that at the end. So the final question is one that I hope we will maybe look a little bit more critically at maybe some aspects of the first question, which is regarding challenges and solidarity. But also, I think, as we've mentioned, like growing class consciousness in the diaspora, as well as, sort of being able to acknowledge physically like where our communities are in the city. My final question is, to all of you, is how do we build spaces that encourage a greater diversity of South Asian and Indo Caribbean artistry and artistic traditions? And perhaps a question that, if we would also like to think about it this way, it's like, how do we make it easy for all immigrants of all backgrounds to express themselves artistically and be supported by artistic communities and spaces?
You already are doing, Amita, by creating this platform right now, bringing us together, knowing everybody. This is the first step, I guess, to learn more about the community that we are living in. Right now, I live in Queens, for instance, but I don't know anyone who are active working in different art space. Right now, I'm more into like practicing more in order to get into great musicals to get into a Broadway show and play there. But I would really, really love to at least create a space where not just Afghans, but everybody from Asia and South Asian countries especially to join, and we all could create our own music, which has the taste, not just Afghan taste, but like the taste of our Asian side. So yeah, and I would love to hear Japrit and Amna, and that if they know anybody, any community, and how they're working, I would love to hear them.
Yeah, I think, I touched on this in my previous question. I think sometimes we, especially we who have privilege and the ability to need to go into community in order to reach community. Y'all had covered the story or the short movie around the taxi driver. I think that is the reality of many working class folks here, right? My dad is a great example of this. He came to this country and he was a poet, he was a singer, but the first job he got here was as a farm picker and then at a moving company, and then he spent the last 30 years driving. Was never able to really fulfill that dream of taking that to a professional level. And that's the reality of many working class South Asian and Caribbean immigrants here, who just might have needed the space or the time, or just have somebody come into their community, right, and be able to do a workshop or a place. One of the things we try to do at Drum is, especially with our youth members, give plenty of opportunity for them to express their artistic inclinations, but also to channel that into movement work. We have some great artists who work on our banners, who create our posters, who help us with our messaging, who put on the little street plays and things along those lines that we do. I think that's really important, and also uplifting the kind of voices that don't often get uplifted. And I think this panel is a great example of this, right? Of like bringing on folks who aren't from the traditional, often Pakistani, North Indian traditions, and bringing in other folks, which is something we try to do often within our kind of celebrations. One of the campaigns we had a couple of years ago was to kick Amazon out of Queens when they were trying to open up their warehouse here. At the celebration of that, when we kicked out Amazon out of Queens, we had Nepali dolkis who played the dol instrument. We had Guyanese tasa players, this whole tasa band, which is kind of this handheld drum, came within our celebration. We had Punjabi tolis, and we had all these kind of different cultural percussion instrument players coming together and vibing with each other, and kind of just having an opportunity to showcase their own culture. So I think opportunities for us to be able to bring performances, shows, workshops into the working class communities like Richmond Hill, Jackson Heights, Kensington, Parkchester, but also making sure that we're uplifting kind of the minority musical traditions as well, and making sure that we're giving them importance, I think is very important.
When I read this question, I feel like two main themes came to mind, and one, I feel like it's really important as we create more spaces with greater diversity to be conscious of how and when we scale it, because while it feels good to build community, I think that part of what feels good is being able to truly express and practice the uniqueness of that culture. And so when we expand it to a more diverse group, then sometimes I think it's just important to make sure that we're keeping space for the individuality of each culture, and not not become like how we're being perceived here, which is South Asian, regardless of where that actually is. I think it's super important that we preserve and celebrate the uniqueness of each place. And also I think that we can do that by making room for all different types of arts, like whether it's culinary arts or visual arts or music or dance or poetry. I think the more diverse the art forms are, the more we can recreate a sense of what it's like at home, and the more people will feel connected and free to express their culture. So I think it has to be across all art forms.
I can go next. You know, it's not so much about the how, so much it is about like the when and the now. You know, we don't wait to build these spaces. We build those spaces on behalf of ourselves, and we recognize that they've always existed. And we may not have had the jargon for it, but when we think about concepts like community-based interventions or mutual aid, we know that this is not something new. And so we continue to document these moments, be it the oral histories or those photographs, and we honor and memorialize the legacy of our ancestors such that it is intergenerational and it is across class. And when we think about disability justice and we think about creating accessible spaces, we create those healing spaces that are holistic, that offer the zine making, the graphic note taking, and we think about how art can breathe new life in messaging and meaning, and much like we've seen with Emory Douglas and the Black Panther Party. Um, and I'll end with this, you know, everything that is worthwhile is done with other people, and so we each can think about what we have to offer.
That was really beautiful, Amna, and everyone for your responses. I'm really struck by something that I keep having to remind myself as I continue in like education about movement building and deepening work, both in local solidarity and global solidarity. Is like, it's not that the space doesn't exist. It's not that it's not about creating like the next new big project and being like, this is what we're doing, everyone. It is tapping into energies that are present all around us, and really like being attuned to and affirming of all of these ways that that space can be reinforced, and how we can reinforce each other. I really appreciate just once again the richness of responses, and Nati, to your point about mindful curation, and to everyone's point about how we continue to uplift and center a diversity of artistic traditions. I think just knowing in our heart of hearts that, like, sometimes you will talk to someone who's like, oh, I didn't know that there were Nepali artists in New York. It's like, yeah, there are. Of course there are. And I think that, being able to recognize that like these spaces exist and we need to come into community with them is more helpful than what it is now, which can sometimes take, which can sometimes be, I don't know, like oh, I didn't know that existed, so we cannot curate them. I think being intentional about how we platform and curate and center, knowing that these spaces exist, is so helpful. And once again, I would like to call back some love to Jagpreet and Amna, really like continuing to name where in New York City, like these neighborhood traditions and these artistic celebrations exist as a part of movement building, because that really continues to inspire like how we think about curating through Brooklyn Raga Massive in the future, and continuing to expand, this practice of, if I can speak to some other things I feel like will encourage a greater diversity of immigrant artists, compensating artists fairly in artistic spaces, and bringing them together, and also like cultivating an audience that I feel is very receptive to hearing a wider variety of aesthetic traditions, especially in classical spaces. I feel like that can be really oppressive if there's always this idea of this is a sound that can exist on stage. And I think that expanding that stage all around is going to be very helpful. So sorry for going on my own little like, this is also what I feel. But I just wanted to thank all of you for, once again, just these really profound answers that speak to your own work and what you would like to see in this space. I believe that BRM doesn't need any excuses about why we can't be more intentional in our curation, and we can continue to be better and tap into all of these energies. So with that, I would like to, there is one question that just popped up in the chat on the YouTube page, but before we get into it, I hope I can just give a really quick ping once more to those of you who are watching at home, who would like to contribute. This is a free panel discussion that will live on the internet in posterity forever. So if you are watching this and feel like you would like to contribute to some of this work, Drum has a member emergency mutual aid fund that is linked in the YouTube caption. So please feel free to give there. There's also linked in the chat, in the caption, the petition to grant temporary protected status to Pakistani climate refugees. So if you feel called to contribute another way that is not financial, that is currently an effort that can help increase sort of this international solidarity, this global solidarity that Drum is undertaking to help Pakistani refugees in their quest to get to the United States and countries that are not experiencing climate change quite as drastically as Pakistan is at the moment. So with that, now that I'm officially on the audience Q&A slide, now I can read out the audience question, which is, the question is, it's really gratifying to hear this discussion, and your actions give us all great hope for the future. Thank you, exclamation mark. Yet how do diverse diasporas overcome political extremism that's ripping them apart? I think this is a pretty timely question. So would love to hear everyone's, people's thoughts on how they are overcoming or addressing how sometimes homegrown political extremism from the countries that we come from can be a tool for, as we've seen in the rise of Hindu supremacy in the United States, things like that. Yes, I'm going to stop there before I keep talking, but would invite anyone to answer if they have any feelings.
I feel like I've been saying this a lot today, so sorry if I'm repeating myself, but I to me the best tools are always education and drawing connection from one human to another. And so it's I feel like that's the tool we have, like having those courageous conversations where we can be heard as a person and not this cliche or stereotype that the person is approaching us with.
I guess two things. First is, I think we need to be careful with how our use of the phrase political extremism, but also kind of how we paint movements in the global South. There is no black and white, especially when our South Asian subcontinent is strife with the impacts of colonialism, neocolonialism, and liberalism, the Cold War, and everything in between. I think there is, though, something to be said about out organizing our enemies. And that comes from, again, the basics of building community, building solidarity, making sure that we're uplifting the voices of those who are most impacted by the violence, by the various institutional and societal factors that are pushing back or keeping them down. And I think a lot, it comes from also making sure that we're embracing the parts of our culture, the parts that we're bringing that keep us connected together, and learning to shed away the parts that are oppressive and have historically been oppressive to various folks, women, queer identified folks, folks who come from lower caste backgrounds or laborers, and so on and so forth. The one thing, the final thing I'll leave off with is like building all the fights that we're fighting, wherever they are in the global South, are connected and are kept going because of imperialist forces, because of a need to cause division. And the only way we're going to come past that is by building international and global justice, building solidarity across. I keep bringing up the anti-colonial movement, but something beautiful, again, about the anti-colonial movement was, especially in the South Asian context, is how it connected with the South African anti-colonial movement, how it connected with the Irish anti-colonial movement, who actually funded a lot of the arms in the armed revolution against the British. And a lot of that kind of deteriorated post-World War II, especially into the Cold War. We don't have to go into why, we all know why to some extent, but rebuilding that, and to some extent it's being built, it's, we're seeing a lot of instances in it, but like rebuilding that idea of global justice, of impacted communities coming together is really important, and the most important thing in making sure that we all can stand up for each other, especially when the powerful forces that are out there aren't going to be the ones who are standing up for us.
Thank you so much, Nadi and Jagpreet, for sharing your thoughts. I think this is something that, we've continued to sort of like hearken to this whole discussion, which is that there's always these dividers. And Jagpreet, I really appreciate you recentering how we define political extremism as being a product of the global South, wherein also individually there is a lot of oppression that we are responsible for shedding in ourselves, because sometimes it's the divisions that we hold on to that prevent us from building into solidarity and connecting into the communities that we can feel supported by, and that we can plug our own efforts into. So I really appreciate naming that distinction, and naming that also this is such much like art, which is so individual and really brings the deepest parts of ourselves into conversations with others. Movement building, solidarity work, it is also a deeply individual experience that requires a lot of individual accountability, as well as our own search for meaning and community with each other. So certainly I think this discussion is part and parcel of that, and I hope that this continues to be a resource for anyone who would like to continue this work, or one of the many resources. There's a lot of resources. So with that, we are just at 8:30, but I would like to invite our panelists, if anyone has anything that they would like to add further to this conversation, please feel free to share any final thoughts.
I guess I'll just finish off with a couple of things. Again, thank you, Amita. Thank you, Nadia and Zarifa, and BRM for putting this together. Like I said before, these conversations are very important, especially as we grow as a diaspora in New York City. We are, pretty old here. But we are slowly starting to grow. So I think the more conversations like these we have, the more we can center what's really important. As I started off this conversation with the history of South Asian and Indo Caribbean folks, of diasporic folks from the South Asian subcontinent in New York City, is one of working class folks. It's the folks who literally built this city and continue to make sure the city operates every day. They're the ones who are out there during the pandemic, driving folks around, working in restaurants to make sure people were still able to be fed, working in stores to make sure people were still able to get the essential supplies and PPE that was needed. They put themselves at risk, and they've done that in the history of New York. It was South Asian, Indo-Caribbean activists in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s who pushed for opening immigration across, not only in South Asia, but opening immigration across the world into America, and removing the quota system, standing shoulder to shoulder with African-American civil rights leaders. We are inherently a racialized minority too. There have been many incidents of hate rhetoric and violence, not only post 9/11, but pre 9/11 as well. And these are the things to keep in mind when thinking of our communities here. We need to push back as much as we can against the model minority myth, because we are in the trenches with our Latino, Latina, and Black brothers and sisters in fighting against white supremacy and institutional violence in America. And I think one of the avenues we do that through is art. And I'm excited to see how art has been incorporated during these past couple of years into highlighting the struggles of our communities here. And I hope to continue to see that. And I know I'll continue to see that.
And I would like to thank everybody too. Thank you, Amita. And thanks everybody who has organized it. It was really nice seeing that there are more people, not just me in New York, feeling lonely and different. There are more, so.
I'd also like to thank the panel and Amita and Brooklyn Raga Massive and Natia and Zarifa, and obviously my great comrade Jagpreet, for all the time and the rich conversations that we've had tonight. I just wanted to add to that original question. When it comes to like the quote unquote termed political extremism, I just want to say that that's not something specific to the diaspora either, as that's something that we see in the States, with the conservative right-wing fascism that's happening right here. And so really the key to that is just to countering that is just effectively organizing that goes beyond the direct service. And, when we think about things like mutual aid, we recognize that it's solidarity, not charity. And when we think about abolishing the industrial complexes that exist, whether it be the prison pipeline, the military, the immigration, you name it, we recognize that that imagination is our knowledge, and that we can imagine a future that exists beyond bars and borders. My own family was post 9/11 and post Trump election were victims of hate incidents, but what has given us that joy is the recognizing that hope is a discipline, and that one day, when we effectively organize and we envision that future for not just for ourselves, but the future generations, that then we recognize how sacred this land and earth are, that is a calling to the ancestral traditions, and we want to hone in on that and heal and bring our whole selves.
Thank you all so much. That was really once again, Amna, just such an important point, because I know that when I read the question, I read political extremism from the vantage point of me telling my parents that Hindu nationalism is a problem, which it is. But you were right. Like there's a lot of political extremism can mean a lot of things, and it's important that we, as Nati said, like continue the process of self-education with the intention of shedding these layers of oppression that live within us individually. So thank you for once again naming that nuance, which I feel is so critical. With that, I would just like to point out that there is one more question, but I feel like this is one that maybe we should all answer together as we move forward in this work, not necessarily right now in this Zoom meeting / YouTube conversation. But the question is, with so many bright minds around how can BRM, Drum, and other organizations partner together to build solidarity? I would like to name that the reason I know about Drum is from a South Asian Americans Leading Together conference in 2018 that I went to. So I do know that Drum is closely plugged into a number of coalition-based organizations such as SALT, which is a national organization. And I can't speak from BRM's perspective, but I just want to invite very quickly if Jagpreet and Amna, if you have any other coalition spaces where people can begin plugging into. Of course, we will encourage everyone to follow Drum on Facebook and follow their website for any updates on their own programming, but just want to invite very quickly the space to share where we can find more examples of this work.
Yeah, for sure. I think if you're looking for in New York City, we work along many coalitions like Communities for Police Reform, who are working to fight and push back against the racist policing policies in New York City. The People's Plan in New York City, who is pushing for a more equitable budget for all of us, including turning back the cuts on schools and defunding the NYPD. I think nationally, there's a lot of other great examples of organizations who are doing good work, like Jagara out in California, SEAC up in New England. But I think it's important to just start having discussions, organizing within your own communities. I do want to plug in though, last minute, it is Giving Tuesday still. And it is a capitalist ruse to get you to donate to your favorite nonprofits, but donate to your favorite nonprofit, which includes us at Drum. Follow us on social media to see examples of where the donations go. We have various funds, including for our delivery driver members who might get injured during the workplace and can't file for any compensation, domestic workers who might be leaving an abusive situation, so on and so forth. It's a great opportunity to contribute. And finally, we also have a C4 arm, which means we engage in political activity, endorsements in local New York City elections, so on. To be a member of Drum Beats, which is our C4, you don't have to be working class, you just have to care and want to work within the community. So you can look us up at drumbeatsnyc.org.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Jagpreet, for that. I'm going to be linking Drum's Facebook in the comments. And then I think after this conversation is over, I'll also go and link in Drum Beats as well, so that we can all be a little bit more clued in, anyone who's watching this in the future. Speaking on BRM's behalf, I do just want to recognize the immense fortune I personally have, not only to host these conversations, but also in the last year and a half that we've been doing the social justice series, we've been really fortunate to platform Parai artists, Dalit Christian activists and artists. We've been really fortunate to feature a number of really talented Afghan artists as well. And just in this series, I think one thing that I really want to keep inviting us to do is to keep making space and being excited for us to look inward and tap into, as mentioned before, where all of this energy exists in our South Asian spaces, and to just be aware of how even in the world of New York City, there are so many more worlds that we can continue to look into, imagine with, organize with, and be excited by. And so I really look forward to continuing in conversation with all of you. And since we are at 8:40, I just want to extend a final massive thank you to our panelists, Zarifa Adiba, who did have to leave, but I am sending her a big thanks. Nathalie Barret-Mas, thank you both so much. And then thank you to Drum as a whole and Jagpreet Singh and Amna Khan for joining us today. I just really appreciate all of your incredible perspectives and look forward to more exciting discussions and knowing where we can be of continued reinforcement in these amazing spaces. So thank you all so much. I will stop my share. I look forward to seeing you all around. Take care.
Thank you.